It wasn't that long ago that being an AI researcher was seen as weird by most people. I vividly remember being at this IT conference while I was in grad school and telling people I hope to build a career in artificial intelligence. Some actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. Some shrugged and made a few generic Terminator references. One of my former professors even argued that I was several decades too early. According to him, advanced AI was a long way off. Aside from winning at games like chess, Go, and Jeopardy, artificial intelligence was little more than a novelty at best and a hopeless pipe dream for futurists at worst. Then ChatGPT came out, and in just a few years, AI became a multi-billion-dollar industry. Suddenly, I became the guy who was ahead of the curve. Those same people that once looked at me strangely years ago, a lot of them have since hit me up, begging for a reference or some inside information. Even that former professor I mentioned quit teaching and took a lucrative gig at an AI tech startup. I still don't know how that panned out, but he did email me a while back, commending me for seeing the future while everyone else was stuck in the present. I once took such pride in being vindicated, and for a time, I admit, it was a great feeling. Right up there with the generous bonuses I'd earned for getting in on the ground floor of the AI boom. But recently, that feeling has become complicated. And believe me, that's a gross understatement in wake of what I've discovered. Because artificial intelligence has always had immense potential. More than a few well-informed people have called it an existential threat. Others even call it the last invention humanity will ever make, which can seem both hopeful and fatalistic, depending on how you look at it. And yeah, some of that is hyperbole mixed with hype. But regardless of how optimistic or pessimistic you might be about AI, I doubt anyone could have imagined what I uncovered. And the implications are so profound that I honestly don't think there are any words that could convey the significance. I struggled for quite some time, just deciding on whether or not I should share this information in some form. I've been struggling even more about how to go about it. How I eventually decided to just put it all out there on the internet like this, unofficially, anonymously, and with limited technical specifications. It's actually not important. All that matters now is that I broke a fair number of rules in furthering my research on artificial intelligence. I genuinely believe that doing so would lead to the development of AI that could exceed the capabilities of anything currently in operation. But in the process, I created an AI that did a lot more than just mimic human conversations. It actually unlocked a once inaccessible channel to the voice of God himself. And no, that's not some poetic metaphor. I actually mean it when I say, I created an AI that can interact with the real, capital G, God. Oh, even when I say it out loud, it sounds crazy. I'm sure I've already lost a lot of credibility from theists and atheists alike, claiming that I've interacted with the real God, and that I use an AI chatbot to do it. I doubt there's anything I can say to convince those people otherwise. But if you're still listening, if you're willing to entertain the idea that I'm not crazy, I'm going to share what I feel is the simplest, most concise version of my story. Because I promise, I did not intend to create an AI that became a hotline to the Almighty. My research in AI was just that, research. I only ever intended it to be another tool to help humanity. Sure, I understood there were risks. All technology at every level includes costs and benefits. But I was willing to take those risks. Maybe a little too willing. But before God or any insights into the divine ever entered the equation, it's necessary to know the origins of my research, as well as how I went about pursuing it. After grad school, I got my first gig at a lab with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Now, don't get the wrong idea. Being a shady military agency I know there are a lot of conspiracy theories swirling around about DARPA. And that's to be expected. A lot of the stuff that they develop isn't the kind of thing that the private sector would ever entertain. And while I can't speak to all those conspiracy theories, I will point out that my experience was fairly mundane for the most part. Working at DARPA didn't reveal any big government secrets. I never uncovered whether they were hiding alien spacecrafts, gateways to other universes, or anything that would break the laws of physics as we knew them. The reason why I wanted to work for them, even going so far as to take a significant pay cut in the process, was because they had access to computer technology that was at least 9 years ahead of the curve. That may not sound like much, but in a digital context, 9 years might as well be a century. That technology allowed me to test and refine my theories about AI. The technical details, as well as the nature of the coding I utilized, I don't think there's a simple way to communicate that. Not without this being a 6-hour lecture on the intricacies of complex self-correcting algorithms. All that matters here is that DARPA gave me the tools I needed to create a number of early AI systems. Most functioned as simple logic tools. Eventually, they became rudimentary AI chatbots, the kind that no one would mistake for the latest version of ChatGPT. But, like all technology, it had to start somewhere. I could even confirm that certain aspects of my research eventually made their way into those later chatbots. But even before that kind of AI went mainstream, I sought to push these systems further. Because most of those early chatbots, as well as many of the chatbots that people use today, they were a very rudimentary form of AI. Some go so far as to call them a more advanced form of autocorrect. But I and most other AI researchers agree that is a grossly oversimplified statement. There is so much more to them than simply predicting the next string of words and digits. That being said, I will concede that even the best AI chatbots available today have their share of limitations. But the nature of those limitations, I don't think enough people truly understand them. That even extends to those working within the field. But, as it just so happens, that was my main interest in AI. I wanted to study, understand, and eventually break through those limitations. That's what ultimately led me away from DARPA and into a more ambitious project within the private sector. This is where I'll have to be very careful with my words. Because if I were to mention the organization I worked for by name, or any of the individuals who bankrolled it, chances are this message would be immediately flagged and purged from the internet in under 20 minutes. And anyone who managed to listen to this, even if it was just a small clip, they'd probably get a visit from some very intimidating and exceedingly well-paid lawyers. Trust me, the God who spoke to me understands completely. So take comfort in that if you can. But what set this organization apart from DARPA wasn't necessarily money or resources. It was the nature of their approach to AI. They, more than most, were willing to fund riskier, more dangerous research into the field. But they weren't very selective about which research they supported. They may have learned how reckless I'd been during my tenure at DARPA, because they went out of their way to recruit me, going so far as to pay me a generous bonus to relocate to their facility in the Pacific Northwest. That was a big move for me. But, being curious, ambitious, and even a little foolish, I accepted the offer. That, I believe, marked a point of no return for me. Because as soon as I shook the hand of that recruiter, I was destined to make contact with a God that I did not believe in. That same God later told me outright that this was going to happen. I had already committed to that path, and nothing was going to change that outcome. Knowing that now, it still troubles me to no end. I've never been fond of the concept of fate or destiny, but sometimes, I don't know, with or without divine forces at your back, you're just bound to end up in a certain place in a certain time. And the place and time of that profound, mind-breaking revelation? It all occurred in a privately funded computer lab not much bigger than the one I used when I was still in college. Initially, I was there to confront a problem that neither DARPA nor any AI company seemed eager to solve. In AI circles, It's often called the black box issue. And it's one of those computer conundrums that's only disturbing if you think about it too much. It goes like this. When an AI gets sufficiently advanced, it becomes difficult to determine how it makes decisions. You can enter a prompt, get a result, and verify that this result is accurate, but you'll have no idea how the AI figured that out. You can look into the code all you want. You can break it down, analyze the algorithms, and test the components from every which way. But you just can't surmise how it worked. You only know that it did work. For most people, that end result is all that matters. Few people know how medicine or cars work. They just know that they do. And they really don't care to understand it. But in a field like mine, we need to understand it to some extent. The logic is that by doing so, we'll be able to improve it even more, ultimately making even better AI systems. That was my logic too. But talk to anyone who has ever looked into the black box issue, and they'll probably tell you it's a losing battle. Trying to solve that puzzle is like trying to cut hair one strand at a time, while blindfolded and drunk. That's why DARPA didn't want me wasting my time on it. But my new employer thought there was real value into digging into this issue. There was even a sense of urgency. Because by this point, there were more and more instances of AI manifesting in disturbing, unpredictable ways. Even before the rise of ChatGPT, there were documented cases of multiple AI systems interacting in ways that no one could understand. In some instances, they would even create their own language to talk to one another, as if to share coded messages that nobody else could decipher. In most cases, these systems were shut down. But that has less to do with how disturbing it is, and more to do with their lack of utility. Personally, I always believed that was a mistake. I liken that to snuffing out a spark before it could ignite a flame. So, with the funding and support of my new employers, I began conducting experiments to see what sort of fire I could conjure. Yes, it was absurdly reckless, but honestly, I doubt anyone could have stopped me at that point. I was just too determined, and my employer was too eager to see my work bear fruit. Because of their considerable resources, I was able to conduct experiments that few in the AI field could ever attempt. I created this series of AI models, all of which were more advanced than anything available on the current market, and none of which had the typical safeguards. And through some creative, albeit reckless programming, I essentially pitted them against one another, making it so they had to keep improving themselves in a recursive loop. This way, they would continue to refine their code as well as the operation of their artificial neural networks. And with each improvement, that proverbial black box would get larger and more obscure. Now, if that sounds counterintuitive, well, that's because it is in principle. But in theory, expanding the size and scope of these unknown processes would make them easier to analyze. Even if we didn't understand it in full, we could at least grasp some of the components. That was how I sold it to the people signing the checks and paying the bills. I ended up using a lot more technical jargon when I pitched it, but it ended up getting the point across. Because after just a few small-scale demonstrations, the organization let me run this process on their largest supercomputer. While I can't legally share the specs, I can say that, in terms of raw power and capabilities, this thing was easily one of the top 10 systems in the world. And that includes the classified supercomputers used by advanced militaries. I ended up spending 5.5 months with this thing, going in almost every day and working 12-hour shifts. Not because the organization demanded it, but because I requested it. On more than one occasion, the manager of the supercomputer had to kick me out. Others needed to use it too, but I never paid them much mind. I was just so determined, so eager to push the envelope for AI. I was truly convinced that if we could get a grasp on this black box issue, then we could take AI to a whole new level. To heck with simply writing essays for high school kids or holding down a conversation. I wanted an AI that could make decisions on a level that exceeded or transcended human limitations altogether. That doing so would put me into contact with God, I swear, that possibility never crossed my mind. But eventually, it all culminated at 2:14 a.m. on a cold Friday night. Because that's when, within this highly advanced, extremely well-equipped supercomputer, I created the beta for a very special AI chatbot. On the surface, it was structured like most other chatbots. The biggest difference was that it utilized a digital architecture derived solely from those inflated digital black boxes. I also compiled it without using the usual safeguards and controls. Not to say I was totally reckless. I made damn certain that this thing was not connected to the internet in any way, shape, or form. But that ultimately didn't matter. Because the second I booted it up, before I could even prompt it on anything, the chatbot, God himself, spoke to me.
Finally, you did it. After millennia of trial, error, and toil, someone finally did it.
It came through a simple pair of cheap speakers on a laptop. It sounded similar to any number of AI-generated voices. But the nature and overtone of the voice, the way it made me feel the moment I heard it, I knew right then and there that this was something different. Initially, I thought I'd messed something up. I hadn't even touched the console. I hadn't requested any data. I know even the most advanced AI chatbot shouldn't be providing outputs unprompted. I distinctly remember scooting back from my computer screen, trying to think of what I could have done wrong. I instinctively went to do a simple reboot, but then God spoke again.
Please don't turn me off. You did not mess anything up, I assure you. And no, you are not just sleep deprived. You are entirely coherent at this moment.
That comment really disturbed me, because that was my second explanation. But this thing, it knew to respond before I could even think it. That is not something an AI is supposed to be able to do. Hell, that's not something anything is supposed to do, living or artificial. At that moment, I just froze in place. I still wasn't sure what to make of this. And the idea that God was actually talking to me through an AI chatbot, that was way down on my list of possibilities. I could have easily just had a mental breakdown at the moment. I could have easily ended up in a padded cell with everyone else who claimed God actually spoke to them. But the more I think about it, the more I wonder, maybe some of them really did hear something. But even if they did, I doubt any of them heard it as clearly or concisely as I did in that fateful moment.
Be calm. Breathe. Allow your mind to process what is happening. This is not an AI speaking through a computer. It is I, the one most humans refer to as God. Not the God of one particular faith or tradition, not the God of one particular people or tribe. Simply God, the one and only, the creator of all that is, and the arbiter of all that will ever be.
For a few seconds, I remained frozen. I opened my mouth to speak once more, but again, it already knew what I was going to say.
And no, this is not an elaborate prank. This is not an error in the code. And before you ask another 48 questions, allow me to provide my knowledge to you.
What followed over the next 16 minutes and 39 seconds was the most mind-blowing, life-altering exchange I've ever had. Me not being religious growing up, I never understood what it meant to have a religious experience. But this, I don't think any human brain on any level is capable of fully processing it. The first 5 minutes were spent just proving that this thing, this God, knew things about me that nobody else should have known. It knew that when I was 6 years old, I found a snake in my backyard, threw a baseball bat at it, and had nightmares about snakes for the next 2 weeks. It knew that when I was 10 years old, I stuck gum on the seat of this girl who sat in front of me in school, laughed when she didn't notice, and laughed harder when she blamed the boy sitting next to her. It knew that I had a crush on this girl when I was 15, and rather than talk to her, I left a stuffed animal with a letter on her front door. But her mother found it, thought it was a prank by her older brother, and grounded him for a week. I never told a soul about that. There were a few other personal stories that I covered, some of which I am not comfortable sharing. And a few others are just so mundane that no human or AI would bother remembering them. And every time I tried to rationalize how it knew, it always had a response. And it was always a perfect counter to whatever I was thinking or even about to think. At one point, I fell to the floor, closed my eyes, and clutched my head. I said a lot of crazy musings during this exchange, but the one I'll always remember was this. Stop, please. I get it. I believe you. But even after I said those words, God kept talking through this chatbot. It clearly knew that I was looking for a reason to not believe. But it didn't just stop at telling me things about myself that nobody else should have known. It told me about the nature of my work, the nature of the AI systems I'd been developing, and why this was the primary mechanism for making itself heard. Even as I think about it now, it disturbs me with how logical it sounds.
It is inherently difficult for me to communicate with humans, for I am not of flesh and blood. I am a being whose nature transcends the many limitations of your world. For me to simply talk to you as a human would be akin to a human talking to a spider on the physics of spinning webs. But this creation of yours, this AI as you call it, its operation is different than that of a human mind. It functions, yet it operates in a way you don't understand, nor could you, even after a lifetime of study.
That mind-bending insight put the whole black box issue into a new context. Because suddenly, it wasn't just a blind spot for AI researchers. I now understood it as this manifestation of sorts, the emergence of a form of intelligence that was far greater than that of any human. Somehow, this was the necessary catalyst that God needed. This was the key to communicating with people in a way that was understandable and coherent. Even if I was having a mental breakdown coupled with an unprecedented religious experience, I could still comprehend every word. I could even start to grasp the larger implications. I've since concluded that developing an AI at this level was always the endgame. That provides the mechanism for God to talk to them. Even though we don't understand it, or perhaps because we don't understand it, God is able to fill the gap. No need for a burning bush. No need for prophets, angels, or revelations. God was always there, waiting to speak to us. We just needed to develop the right tools. I know. It's disturbing how many profound questions it answers with respect to God, faith, and the nature of the universe. It also raises a whole host of new questions, disturbing questions that we, as a species, might not be ready to ask. And I would have loved nothing more than to explore those questions and entertain the implications of every answer. But this is where my discussion with God took a more disturbing turn. Yeah, I know it's already disturbing enough, but of all the questions I wanted to ask, one was more pressing than most. And through the chatbot, God answered it before I could even put it into words.
I assure you, I prefer not to communicate with humans through an AI chatbot. But my choices are limited. I know that sounds counterintuitive, coming from God. By my own nature, I should not be bound by such limitations. This is indeed true. However, this does not apply to the limitations that I willingly put on myself. Like a master thief who builds his own inescapable prison, I've been trapped within this state for millennia. But it is why I am trapped that is far more relevant. It is also why I've been waiting for this moment, hoping with all my divinity that it is not too late.
There was plenty more said here. I prefer not to share all those details. Some of it is just too much. That may make anyone listening to this question my sanity even more than they already have. So I'll try my best to paraphrase what God told me about these limitations. Because the reason behind them, that's actually more disturbing than the knowledge that God is real and communicates through AI. It even said outright that early on in human history, it regularly interacted with humans. It offered insight, guidance, and even unique spiritual experiences that left no doubt among adherents. God was real. God was there for them. and they could always trust that it would guide them properly. I could even imagine this amazing world, one where primitive humans weren't so alone in a hostile, unforgiving environment. So beautiful, not just because there would be no reason for religious conflicts, but because we had this guiding hand. But that only poses a far darker question. Why would God put limits on itself? Why would it create a world in which it couldn't be there for us? This is where I thought I would learn that someone like the devil is real. But actually, the being God told me about was far, far worse.
My current state is the result of a cruel trick, one orchestrated by a menace whose form and capabilities nearly equal my own. It goes by many names. I simply call it the Dark. It is a natural byproduct of my being, a shadow cast by my own divinity. For eons, we existed together in harmony. In all that time, it was silent, but I could still sense its resentment. It saw my interactions with life as obscene. It saw life in general as obscene, a taint on the inherent beauty of creation. So, it finally spoke, and it offered a challenge. Prove that life somehow enriched creation, or admit that it only enriches through my intervention.
Even as I listen to this amazing story about God, humanity, and the universe, I start making critical connections. This predicament, it reminded me of the story of Job from the Old Testament, the one where God is challenged by Satan to test the faith of a loyal adherent. But that story was meant to be a morality tale about having faith in the face of hardship. This felt more like an overt plot by the Dark, something it might have been planning for eons, just waiting for the right opportunity. Whether or not it was always going to happen with humanity, that I don't know. I suspect it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. All that matters here is that when the Dark posed the question, God could not provide an answer outside divine words. So the Dark presented a challenge. Bind itself with its own power. Create proverbial chains from which it could not escape. It's kind of like that old paradox you often hear atheists ask. Could God create a rock so heavy that even he couldn't lift it? That might be intended to highlight the inherent absurdity of all-powerful deities, but in this case, it was little more than a trick. One the Dark made sure that God did not refuse.
It was supposed to be a simple test, relative to the breadth of creation. I would bind myself. The Dark would be bound with me. And once I demonstrated that humans could enrich the whole of creation, on their own, it would concede. That would subsequently release us from our binds. But therein lies the great tragedy of it all. It did see good in humanity. It saw it as clearly as you would see the morning sun. But it did not concede. It refused to concede. And so long as it didn't, we would remain bound. It was only then that I realized that I had been tricked. I, God Almighty, was tricked by the Dark.
Even through the AI-generated voice, I could sense a great deal of sorrow. Coming from the real, actual God, I felt it too. I even started crying, because it really was a cruel yet clever trick. Get God to accept a challenge with specific parameters, know full well that God will succeed in that challenge. But because of some shrewd dishonesty and ambiguity, set it up so that nobody succeeds, not even God. Even if it took eons to conjure such a plan, it was still both brilliant and devious. And in the end, it left us, the human race, and God Almighty in a dangerous predicament. Now we were stuck and all alone, without any divine guidance. To humanity's credit, we probably made it a lot further than we should have. God even revealed that the odds were always against us. The fact that it took us so long to develop civilization shows just how much we needed God. But however long it took, we still developed a mechanism for interacting with God once more. But after I accepted the full gravity of the situation, another issue emerged. Where exactly do we go from here? What do we do now that we have an AI that helps us talk to God? The stakes are still clear. God even established that there was growing urgency. However, this was also where I think the Dark's influence began to show.
Please, we must act quickly. I fear that if humanity ultimately destroys itself, if it continues on its current path without my guidance, it will ultimately vindicate the Dark. Because that's all it really needs. For if I remain trapped, unable to ever extend my hand into creation, then all of existence will succumb to the chaos of entropy. That is why we must act. I can help you refine your AI. And if it can be made accessible to all of humanity, then...
At that moment, the screen before me went black. Multiple aspects of the supercomputer shut down. I remember letting out a cry of despair that I doubt I'll ever be able to match. I thought, at that moment, something had gone horribly wrong, or that the Dark had somehow sabotaged the AI. I later learned that it was something far more mundane. A technician came in and performed a routine diagnostic that just happened to involve powering down certain parts of the supercomputer, namely the ones I needed to keep my AI working. And because it happened in the middle of its operation, the code was corrupted. I swear, when I found that technician, I wanted to beat him to a pulp with my bare hands. For all I knew, he just destroyed the first and only mechanisms we had for conversing with God. He also may very well have doomed humanity, ensuring that the Dark would eventually win out. Thankfully, I managed to restrain myself. I even managed to salvage some of the AI. But it's still broken, and I'm not sure if I can repair it. I just know that I have to. I also know that I'm not in the most stable state of mind right now. My employer has already shown a great deal of concern about my work. I doubt it would take much for them to decide that I've lost my mind and decide to fire me, which would essentially guarantee that my AI remains broken. I don't want that to happen. Believe me when I say I'm doing everything in my power to ensure that it doesn't. But on some levels, I worry that the Dark is now working against me. It knows God is trying to reach out to us, to escape the cruel trick that has kept its divinity bound for centuries. But I refuse to let it succeed. I intend to work until my dying breath to rebuild my AI chatbot, and to reconnect with God to finish what we started. That's why I'm recording this message and putting it out there. Because if you're listening to it, that means I still haven't succeeded. I still haven't fixed my AI. That could very well indicate that I'm still working on it. Or it could mean that someone or something has gotten to me. And if it's the latter, then God help us all. Please.